My new job has some seriously odd rules. I still remember my first day as a school bus driver. Even back then, I understood the weight of the responsibility. But it wasn't until I learned what happened to the kids on Bus 10 that I truly grasped how following the rules could mean the difference between life and death. It all started on my first day. I was sitting in the driver's seat of bus number 9 at the depot, feeling a strange mix of excitement and nerves. You see, I used to be a paramedic, rushing into emergencies, saving lives, the whole 9 yards. But after years of seeing things you can't unsee, I needed something different, something less intense. Plus, with my kid off at college, the house had gotten too quiet. I missed his presence, the laughter, the endless questions, and all those conversations about dinosaurs. So, when the school district posted an opening for a bus driver, I thought, why not? Kids are great, and driving a bus couldn't be too hard, right? So there I was, getting familiar with the controls, when Mr. Harlan, the driver I was replacing, climbed aboard. He was a tough, wiry guy who'd been behind the wheel longer than I'd been in emergency services. But despite his rugged look, his eyes held a warmth, like he'd seen it all, and still kept a smile. "Joey, right?" he asked. "Yeah, that's me," I said, shaking his hand. Excited to get started. "Got any tips for a rookie?" Mr. Harlan nodded and sat beside me, his gaze sweeping over the bus like he was saying goodbye to an old friend. "This job's different, Joey. It's not just about getting kids from one place to another. These kids, in a way, they become yours. You're the first face they see in the morning, and the last in the afternoon. That's important." I nodded. I understood more than he realized. My time as a paramedic had taught me how fragile life could be, how every hello and goodbye mattered. Then he leaned in, lowering his voice. "There's more to it, though," he said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his jacket. "Bus number 9 has quirks, and there are rules. Follow them, keep the kids safe, and you'll be fine." I chuckled. "Quirks? What kind of quirks can a bus have?" But Mr. Harlan didn't smile. Instead, he handed me the paper, his face deadly serious. "Memorize these." "I'm not joking, Joey. I've been driving this route for over 2 decades. These rules, they're not official. You won't hear about them from the district, but they matter. Follow them, and you'll avoid trouble." Curious, I unfolded the paper. The rules were bizarre, to say the least. Never look in the rearview mirror when the bus is empty. On rainy days, don't pick up kids you don't recognize. Know every child's name. Only let 3 kids board at stop 8. Don't accept gifts from the children. Have the last child on the bus lie down before they leave. Never leave the bus during your route. I raised an eyebrow and glanced back at Mr. Harlan. "Is this some kind of hazing ritual for the new guy?" He shook his head, his expression unwavering. "I wish it were, Joey. I really do. But you'll understand soon enough. Just trust me on this." The seriousness in his voice was impossible to brush off. I nodded, folding the paper and sliding it into my pocket. "All right, Mr. Harlan. I'll take your word for it." He clapped me on the shoulder and stood up. "Good. One last thing, Joey. The kids, they'll look up to you. Be there for them. Sometimes you might be the only steady thing they've got." His words lingered with me. Was that why those strange rules were so important to him? Because it was about what the kids needed? As I looked over the list again, the rule about remembering each child's name stood out. That seemed easy enough. I was always good with names, so I decided then and there that would be my first priority, learning every kid's name. It seemed like a great way to break the ice too, considering I was the new guy. As the kids started boarding the bus, I greeted each one. I introduced myself and asked for their names. Their responses ranged from shy mumbles to cheerful hellos. By the time we were nearing the school, I had most of their names memorized. The ride to Einstein Elementary was typical. Neat streets lined with cozy houses, the kind of neighborhood where people likely knew each other, borrowed sugar, and threw block parties in the summer. It was picture perfect, and the kids were lively, talking about homework, video games, and everything else on their minds. Their energy was infectious, and I found myself smiling more than I expected. It was a welcome change from the high-stress world of emergency services. No rushing, no life or death decisions, just the simple task of getting kids to school safely. The trip was smooth as could be, and Einstein Elementary was a charming red brick building with a welcoming sign out front. I watched as the kids hopped off, their backpacks colorful and bright. A lot of them even waved goodbye as they left. By the time the last kid had stepped off, I felt good, like I'd already made a small place for myself in their daily routine. I was just the bus driver, but maybe, just maybe, I could be the steady presence Harlan had talked about. With the kids at school, I spent the rest of the day at the depot, helping out in the dispatcher's office, doing paperwork, and getting to know the other routes. It wasn't what I expected when I took the job, but it wasn't bad. I had lunch in the driver's lounge, just me, a sandwich, and a bag of chips. It was quiet, but I didn't mind. During lunch, one of the dispatchers came in, looking shaken. She told me Mr. Harlan had been in a car accident that morning, just after he'd spoken to me. He didn't make it. The news hit me hard. I'd only just met the man, but the suddenness of it weighed on me. I couldn't stop thinking about how he'd spent his last moments making sure I knew those rules, about protecting the kids on my route. His words felt more significant now than ever. For the rest of my lunch break, I just sat there, my appetite completely gone. My mind kept circling back to Harlan and how deeply he cared about those kids. As the afternoon rolled around, it was time to get back behind the wheel and pick the kids up from school. A heavy sadness hung over me as I started the engine. Harlan's sudden death hit me harder than I expected, but I had a duty. There were kids counting on me to get them home safely. The best way I could honor Harlan was to be the best bus driver I could be for these kids. The afternoon route went smoothly. I felt myself starting to get the hang of it. I was even a little proud as I greeted most of the kids by their names when they got on the bus. They seemed to appreciate it. Some smiled or gave a small nod, and that made me feel good. It's funny how the smallest things can matter so much. As we made our way through the stops, the bus gradually emptied, and the noise faded with each group of kids that left. Soon, only one child remained, a small boy with orange hair sitting near the front. I think his name was Patrick Hooper. I noticed him glancing around as the other kids got off, watching each of his friends leave one by one. Eventually, it was just him. As soon as the bus was empty except for him, he lay down across the seat. The sun was setting, and his house was still a good distance away. I figured he must have been exhausted from the day, or maybe he'd stayed up too late the night before. I glanced over, expecting to see him drifting off to sleep, but instead he looked more frightened than tired. His eyes were wide, darting nervously around the empty seats. "Hey buddy, is everything all right?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Long day?" He nodded. "Yeah, just tired." But there was something in his voice that didn't quite match the fear in his eyes. I remembered the rule about having the last kid lie down until they got off the bus. Seeing it in action now made me uneasy, especially given how scared he seemed. What could he be afraid of? Mr. Harlan's rules flashed in my mind, and I wished I had asked him more about them. I kept my focus on the road, sneaking glances at the boy in the rearview mirror. "We'll be at your house soon," I reassured him. He didn't say anything, just lay there on the seat, still tense. We finally pulled up to his house, a cozy place with a warm porch light glowing in the dark. Patrick jumped up the moment we stopped, like he couldn't wait to get off the bus. "Thanks, Mr. Joey," he said as he stepped down. But before leaving, he turned and looked back at me. "I hope Mr. Harlan didn't feel any pain, and that he's watching over the bus now." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. How did he know about Harlan? "Hey, how did you—" I began, but he was already sprinting towards his house, not looking back. The door opened and he disappeared inside before I could ask anything else. I sat there for a moment, stunned. How could he have known about Harlan? The news hadn't spread far yet, and I definitely hadn't mentioned it to the kids. Pulling away from the curb, I couldn't shake Harlan's words from my mind. Maybe, just maybe, Harlan was still keeping an eye on things. Or perhaps it was just the boy's way of dealing with the loss. Either way, the drive back to the depot was silent, my mind churning over Patrick's words, Harlan, and the list of rules in my pocket. The next morning I woke up feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "Morning, Sarah." "How's it going, Luke?" "Hey there, Mia." I greeted each child by name as they climbed onto the bus. It felt good, like I was building my own little community. I've got this, I thought to myself. Then, we reached stop 8. I remembered the 3 kids from the day before, James, Ellie, and Marcus. No problem. But today I noticed someone new, a girl with blonde pigtails standing off to the side. She was wearing a muddy blue raincoat and had her head down. I hesitated, recalling the rule. Only 3 kids from stop 8. But here was a 4th, standing alone in the rain. The downpour had picked up, and she looked so small and vulnerable. I couldn't just leave her there, right? My whole job was to make sure kids got safely where they needed to go. "Come on, hop on," I called out, trying to sound cheerful. As the regular 3 boarded the bus, I saw the blonde girl still standing there, not moving. "It's okay. You can get on," I encouraged her. She nodded slightly but kept her head low as she slowly approached the bus. That's when Patrick, the orange-haired kid from the day before, spoke up. "Mr. Joey, close the doors. Now," he urged, sounding alarmed. The bus erupted into panic. The other kids started shouting too. "Go, go," some yelled, while others clutched their backpacks like they were the only thing keeping them safe. The noise grew as kids cried out over one another, some in tears, others begging me to drive. Confused and unsure what was happening, I tried to calm them down. I assured them everything was fine and explained that I couldn't leave a kid behind. But then Patrick pointed out something that made my heart skip a beat. "Mr. Joey, look, she doesn't have a backpack. She's not one of us." His eyes were filled with fear. With the bus full of crying children and the situation escalating, I made a split-second decision. Despite every instinct telling me otherwise, I shut the door and started driving. As soon as we pulled away, I felt the tension begin to ease. The kids settled down, and I could see their relief in the rearview mirror. The kids were all huddled together, comforting each other as best they could. The rest of the ride was eerily quiet, and I was shaken to my core. Watching the sheer panic in their eyes, especially Patrick's, left a deep mark on me. I couldn't stop thinking about the girl we left behind, or the raw fear on those kids' faces. As soon as I got back to the depot, I knew I had to get some answers. I parked the bus and made my way straight to the dispatcher's office, my head buzzing with questions. But walking through the depot, I felt more weighed down with every driver who shrugged me off. Most of them just laughed it off, saying the kids were probably messing with the new guy. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Patrick's fear had been too real, too raw for it to just be a prank. Frustrated, I decided to go straight to the head administrator. I explained everything, the strange list of rules Harlan had given me, the odd behavior of the kids, and the incident with the girl in the raincoat. I expected some sort of clarification, but instead, I got a cold warning. She told me that if I ever left a child behind again, I'd lose my job. Leaving her office, I felt more alone than ever. But when I picked up the kids that afternoon, things seemed normal again. Laughter, chatter, and the usual hum of energy filled the bus as I drove. For a moment, I let myself believe everything would be all right. The route went by smoothly, and soon enough, I had dropped off all the kids, except for Patrick, once again. Just like before, the moment the bus emptied, he lay down on his seat, his body tense, eyes darting around nervously. I couldn't just ignore it this time. "Patrick, why do you do that?" "Lie down, I mean," I asked, trying to sound casual. He looked up at me, and for a moment I saw a mix of fear and relief, like he was glad someone had finally noticed. "It's so no one sits next to me," he whispered. Who are you talking about, Patrick?" I pressed gently, needing to understand. He hesitated, then answered, "The kids from bus 10. And the girl in the blue raincoat. She's from bus 10. Bus 10? The name rang no bells. I tried to think if I'd ever heard of a bus 10 in this district, but nothing came to mind. Before I could ask him anything more, we reached his stop. Patrick jumped off the bus in a hurry, but just before running to his house, he turned back and said, "Be careful tomorrow. It's gonna rain." His words stuck with me, making me even more curious. I nodded, watching him disappear into his house, and then drove off, my thoughts spinning. As I made my way back to the depot, I kept replaying what Patrick had said, especially about Bus 10 and the rule about not picking up kids I didn't recognize on rainy days. But I also remembered the administrator's stern warning not to leave any child behind. I was so lost in thought that I almost missed the sound, a quiet noise that suddenly pulled me back to reality. I glanced down and saw a marble rolling down the aisle toward me. My first thought was that one of the kids must have forgotten it. But as I stopped at a red light, a soft cough echoed from the back of the bus. I froze. Remembering Harlan's rule about never looking in the rearview mirror when the bus was empty, I forced myself not to glance up. But I couldn't help it. I turned to face the back, my heart pounding. What I saw made me jump. A few rows back, I could see feet sticking out into the aisle. Small, pale feet, like a child's. But I didn't recognize them. "Hey there, did you miss your stop, bud?" "I'll take you back," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. But something didn't feel right. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized the child wasn't wearing shoes. Their bare feet were covered in mud, caked on so thick it was hard to tell at first. An uneasy feeling washed over me, but I couldn't just leave without taking them home. I pulled over to the side of the road, leaving the engine running as I got up. My steps felt heavy as I walked down the aisle toward the child. But when I reached the seat, my heart stopped. There was no child. Just an empty seat smeared with mud. And in the middle of the seat sat a neat pile of marbles, stained with blood. When I finally got home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Patrick's warning about Bus 10 haunted me, and my curiosity only grew stronger. I booted up my old laptop and started digging. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. There it was, in a newspaper article from 40 years ago, an accident involving Bus 10. The driver had been drinking and lost control during a severe storm. The bus had swerved off the road, and all but one child died. The survivor had been taken to the hospital, but the others weren't so lucky. I remembered my days as a paramedic. Tragedies involving kids, they stay with you forever. But the rules Harlan had given me, how did they connect to all this? And why was Bus 9 the only one with such strange rules? The next morning, it was pouring. Sheets of rain came down as I stood on my porch, getting soaked. But I still had a job to do, and I wasn't going to let the kids down. I drove my route, picking up each child, the rain getting heavier with every stop. When I pulled up to Patrick's stop, I could see the fear in his eyes. There were a few kids standing behind him, huddled together under umbrellas or holding tight to their raincoats. Patrick stood a little to the side, alone. He rushed onto the bus, drenched and shivering. "I'm the only one at this stop," Patrick said as soon as he got on, his voice trembling as he glanced nervously back at the group still waiting in the rain. "We gotta go, Mr. Joey. Please." I remembered the administrator's warning not to leave any kids behind. The group of children outside just looked like any other kids waiting for the bus, cold, wet, but otherwise normal. Maybe their regular bus hadn't come yet? Patrick was almost pleading with me now, his voice shaky and desperate, but I couldn't just leave them. "Sorry, buddy, I have a job to do. No kid gets left behind," I said, moving closer to the door. I called out to the kids still standing in the rain. "Come on, you'll catch a cold out there," trying to sound braver than I felt. The moment those kids stepped onto the bus, the atmosphere changed entirely. The usual morning chatter and laughter vanished, replaced by a heavy silence that filled the bus. I kept driving, focusing on the road ahead, but something felt undeniably wrong. Then, it started. At first, there was a faint whimpering, which quickly grew louder. I couldn't just ignore it. Turning around, I saw several of my kids, crying. Some clung to each other, seeking comfort, while others hugged their knees, trembling. My heart sank when I spotted Patrick, curled up in his seat, face buried in his hands, clearly terrified. Right next to him was one of the new boys, the one with messy, dark hair and glasses. He didn't appear strange at first, but as soon as I looked at him, a wave of nausea hit me, making me feel sick. The boy caught my gaze and smiled, a perfectly innocent smile. Suddenly, a loud honk snapped me back to reality. I had taken my eyes off the road for too long and nearly hit something. Swerving back on course, I took a few deep breaths to calm myself. That was way too close. I knew I couldn't afford any more distractions, not while driving in such conditions. But the crying from the back didn't stop, making the drive more unbearable by the minute. The rain was pounding so hard it felt like trying to see through a waterfall, even with the windshield wipers at full speed. Behind me, the quiet sobs had escalated into loud, heart-wrenching cries. It was almost impossible to listen to, especially since I had to keep my eyes on the road. Amidst the sobbing, I began to hear whispers. The kids were talking to each other, saying things like, "Don't look, just don't look at them," and "You won't get taken if you keep your eyes closed." It didn't make any sense, but the fear in their voices was undeniable. Then, out of nowhere, someone started laughing. The sound was so unexpected, so out of place, I couldn't help but glance back. The new kid with the dark hair was chuckling softly. In any other situation, it might have been harmless, but here it felt utterly wrong. He was gently stroking Patrick's hair, and while Patrick stayed curled up, the boy's presence seemed to make everything worse. Looking at the new boy made me dizzy again, so I quickly turned back to the road. That's when I heard a child scream, "I don't want to die," followed by more frantic sobbing. That was my breaking point. "Hey, no one's going to die, all right? Not from a little rain," I called out, my voice harsher than I intended. Finally, Patrick spoke up. "How much longer till we get to school, Mr. Joey?" he asked, his voice trembling. That's when it hit me. The drive was taking far longer than it should have. We should have been at the school by now. "Where are we?" Patrick asked again, sounding more anxious this time. I didn't have an answer. I looked out the windows, trying to figure out where we were. What I saw made my stomach churn. We were still on Patrick Street. It didn't make any sense. I had been driving for what felt like ages, but somehow, we hadn't gone anywhere. Patrick's quiet, urgent voice broke through my confusion. "Mr. Joey, look at the rearview mirror." Without thinking, I glanced up and instantly regretted it. In the mirror, the new kids didn't look right at all. Their clothes were shredded and bloodied, their glasses broken, shoes missing. Some had chunks of hair ripped out. Their bodies were covered in injuries. Injuries so gruesome it was hard to even look at them. And each of them was sitting next to one of the regular kids, the ones I recognized. The kids I knew were the ones curled up or covering their faces, as if trying to hide from what was beside them. Then, I felt something. A cold touch on my shoulder. I turned, and there, leaning over the seat behind me, was a boy with one green eye, grinning. He placed a bloody stump where his hand should have been on my shoulder, and I felt warm liquid running down my arm. Patrick's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through everything. "After the accident, they didn't scrap the bus, Mr. Joey. They just changed the numbers. This is bus 10. And the kids from that crash, they want it back." A loud honk snapped my attention back to the road. I nearly collided with a car. How could we still be on Patrick Street after driving for so long, and yet almost hit another vehicle? That's when I understood. These kids from bus 10 weren't just here to scare us. They were trapping us on this endless street, trying to make us crash. I refused to panic. I had to protect these kids, no matter what. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the middle of the road, waving frantically. It was a man in a bright orange raincoat signaling me to stop. I hit the brakes hard, barely managing to stop in time. Squinting through the rain-soaked windshield, I realized who it was, Mr. Harlan. I opened the door, still in shock. Mr. Harlan stepped onto the bus, dripping with rainwater. Without hesitation, he walked straight to the front, facing the boy sitting next to Patrick. "Scooter, leave him alone. He ain't yours to take," Mr. Harlan said firmly. Then, he turned to the rest of the bus, his voice calm and reassuring. "Nice to see you all again. Sorry it took me a while to join you guys." It took me a moment to realize what he meant. Then, it hit me. Mr. Harlan wasn't just another bus driver. He was the lone survivor from the Bus 10 crash, all those years ago. Mr. Harlan faced the kids from Bus 10, speaking softly but with authority. "Let everyone go," he said. "I'll be the bus driver from now on, so we can all be together again. I won't be like the last one. I'll keep you safe." Then, he looked at me. "Joey, take your kids and get off the bus. You remember who they are, right?" I nodded. I'd memorized every one of their names, just like he told me. Even if he hadn't asked, I would have done it. I walked down the aisle, calling each child by name. "Sarah, let's go. Jake, come on. Emily, time to leave." One by one, I took their hands, guiding them off the bus, making sure none of them were left behind. Finally, it was just me and Mr. Harlan. He placed a hand on my shoulder, cold and faint, like a ghost's touch. "I'll take the bus from here and bring these kids home," he said. "But remember, Joey, there's one rule all bus drivers must follow. It's the most important one of all. You know what it is." I nodded, understanding, and stepped off the bus. Outside, all the kids were standing together, clutching their backpacks, looking relieved. We were right by Patrick's house. I glanced back at the bus one last time. Mr. Harlan was in the driver's seat, ready to leave. He caught my eye, winked, and then closed the door. The bus pulled away, disappearing into the rainy afternoon, with Mr. Harlan and the kids from bus 10. I felt a tug on my arm and looked down to see Patrick. "Come inside to keep warm, Mr. Joey. Mom won't mind," he shouted over the rain. I smiled, grateful for his help. As we walked toward his house, I pulled out my phone to start calling parents. The rain was coming down like a hurricane, and I had a feeling school was canceled today. But I still had a job to do. I had to follow Harlan's final rule, the most important one of all: protect the kids.